Okay, so one thing that we figured out is that similar to the relationship between a rectangle and a square, or a rhombus and a square, is a kite and a rhombus. So if you like look at our poster right there, you can see that we made the kite a third branch, like not off of parallelograms, like kite is its own branch, but then we had to connect kite and rhombus. And so one thing that we figured out is like the definition of a kite is a quadrilateral with two pairs of congruent adjacent sides. So these two would be congruent and these two would be congruent.
Can you guys write that definition on the board, please, somewhere else?
Yeah.
Maybe down at the bottom
Do
there
you
for
want
kite.
this?
So, and can you say that again, Shay? Just reiterate the definition of a kite so everyone can write it down.
Yeah, a quadrilateral with two pairs of congruent adjacent sides. So like here's one pair, they're next to each other and they're congruent. Here's another, they're next to each other and they're congruent.
And can you explain, well, let's give people a minute to write it down. Then I'd love to hear from you and Kristen. Why did you make that branch between kite and rhombus? What's the reason?
So the definition that we have for the rhombus is a quadrilateral with all four sides congruent. So if we are to draw it the way we did with the kite, it looks like kind of like this, but all four sides are congruent. So a rhombus would be a type of kite because it's just a kite with, instead of having two pairs of adjacent congruent sides, all adjacent sides are congruent.
Doesn't that make them different?
It makes it a type of it. So similar to how you have a rhombus, going off of a rhombus is a square. So a square is always a rhombus is not always a square. It's the same thing with a kite would break off of a rhombus. It's easier if you have it like here so that you can like see. This is kind of confusing because it's like diagonal. So it's a kite is a type of quadrilateral, and Kristen wrote the definition: a quadrilateral with two pairs of congruent adjacent sides. So here's one pair, here's another pair. Instead of having two pairs of that, in a rhombus, all four adjacent sides are congruent. So there are still two pairs of congruent adjacent sides, but instead of seeing it as two pairs, you just see them as all sides are congruent. They still have all two pairs of congruent adjacent sides, but it's more specific because all four sides or both pairs are congruent and adjacent. Ellery.
So is your arrow going from kite to rhombus?
Yes. So. Sorry, that's like a bad arrow. Ooh. So, like how we said, a square is always a rectangle because it has the four right angles. It's a quadrilateral. It has opposite parallel sides that are congruent. It's the same thing with a kite and a rhombus. So a rhombus is always going to be a kite. It's always going to have two pairs of congruent adjacent sides, but a kite isn't always going to be a rhombus. It can have two pairs of congruent adjacent sides, but both pairs don't have to be congruent to each other.
But they could be.
But they can be. So a rhombus is always going to be a kite. We can write that like we did with the other one. So a rhombus is always a kite. It's always going to have the two pairs of congruent adjacent sides, but a kite is not always going to be a rhombus. It can have all four sides congruent and adjacent, but it doesn't have to be. So it's the same thing we had with a rectangle is a square and a rhombus is a square. A rhombus is always a kite, but a kite is not always a rhombus.
John, Then how does that relate to a square? Because a square also always has a quadrilateral and it also always has two pairs of congruent adjacent sides.
Well, as we said before, with like since you're connecting kite and rhombus, a more specific type of rhombus is a square. So a kite can also be a square. It has the attributes before it. A square does have congruent adjacent sides. So a square can also be a kite, but a kite is not always a square. It's the same thing with all other parts of a tree.
Then shouldn't we draw a line directly from kite to square if we drew a line directly from rhombus to
You
square?
don't need to, because a rhombus has a line going from rhombus to square, and a type of rhombus is a square, so it's connecting further down the tree. It's the same with you don't have to have a line from a square to a parallelogram, because we know because it's a rectangle it is a parallelogram. Same thing with a kite. If a kite is a rhombus, then it can also be a square, but it doesn't have to be.
True or false? A square is a kite. True? Okay. Okay. Why is that, Sophia? Why is a square a kite?
If a kite is a quadrilateral with two pairs of congruent adjacent sides, then a square meets all of those requirements already.
So a square is a very specific type of kite.
Precisely.
All right. Round of applause for Kristen and Shay. Thank you very much.